Buenos días, presidente de la Fundación, embajador de la India, director general para América del Norte, Europa del Este, Asia y Pacífico, queridos patronos, compañeros de la Fundación Consejo España-India, queridas amigas y amigos. Bienvenidos a la Fundación Ramón Areces. Para mí y para mi institución es no solo una satisfacción, sino un honor que el Observatorio España-India se lance en esta casa. Esta casa que, como ustedes saben, es una institución comprometida con la investigación científica y con la difusión de la cultura. Me complace además que pueda tener lugar en este auditorio que ha sido recientemente renovado para este tipo de eventos. Por aquí pasan distintas personalidades. Solo la semana pasada tuvimos a 2 premios Nobel, aquí un premio Nobel de Química y otro de Economía. Y es por eso, por lo que nos enorgullece contar con la presencia del profesor Raja Mohan, uno de los mayores expertos en política exterior india, al que atentamente escucharemos para comprender la visión que tiene India del Indo-Pacífico y de la participación potencial, y espero que sea real, en esta región estratégica. No olvidemos que India es la primera democracia del mundo, hecho que la singulariza y la caracteriza, y creo que nos obliga a todo el resto de las democracias a apoyar sin duda ninguna. España y la India han tenido un déficit histórico de conocimiento y de contactos mutuos. Hay que remediarlo. España, sin duda ninguna, debe prestar un mayor interés en una región que representa cerca del 40% del PIB y del 60% de la población mundial, y creciendo en ambos aspectos. El papel clave de la India dentro del sistema de coaliciones bilaterales y multilaterales del Indo-Pacífico en los ámbitos de la seguridad, de la conectividad y la innovación demuestra que es un socio clave en la región. La India está adquiriendo un papel protagonista cada vez mayor y está llamada a jugar un papel en el que nos gustaría asociarnos a todos. La India ha estado presente en la Fundación Ramón Areces, como los directores de Casa Asia que andan por aquí y exdirectores pueden dar testimonio. Siguiendo el supuesto hecho de la importancia de la India en muchos campos estratégicos y científicos, hemos intentado traer aquí a pensadores importantes en el ámbito científico y en el ámbito cultural. Titankar Roy, profesor de Historia Económica de la London School of Economics, Brahma Chelani, Sam Pitroda, muchos han pasado por aquí, y muchos, sobre todo, especialistas en los grandes sectores en los que la India excele, las matemáticas, la computación, la inteligencia artificial, por no hablar de los innovadores tecnológicos de Bangalore y otros sitios. Nuestro compromiso también se resalta en la medida en que hemos intentado participar en los trabajos del patronato de la Fundación Consejo España-India, que promueve con gran éxito este proyecto, que también va a contar con la participación que sea requerida de nuestra parte. Nuestra colaboración con la Fundación Consejo España-India también nos ha llevado a acoger iniciativas como el Diálogo España-India en Desafíos Globales, Geoeconómicos y Defensa, que organizamos conjuntamente en esta misma casa en 2015, con el objetivo de promover el intercambio entre los think tanks indios y españoles y aumentar el conocimiento mutuo. Entiendo que hoy, después de este acto, va a haber un acto parecido. Solamente me queda expresar nuestra satisfacción, profesor Mohan, por tener aquí, nuestro agradecimiento a la Fundación Consejo España-India por estar aquí con nosotros, a la Embajada, y desearles todo lo mejor a este observatorio. Muchas gracias.
Presidente, ahora va a tomar la palabra Juan Ignacio Entrecanales, presidente de la Fundación Consejo España-India.
Bueno, muy buenos días. Empiezo dando las gracias a la Fundación Areces y a su director, el embajador, que esta institución de referencia nos deje estar aquí hoy en esta presentación, este lanzamiento del observatorio. Sigo agradeciendo al embajador, amigo de la Fundación, Dinesh Patnaik, por estar aquí con nosotros. Lleva prácticamente un año en su embajada y yo creo que ya es una embajada de referencia aquí. El apoyo que nos ha prestado es fundamental y yo creo que es un beneficio tremendo para esa relación bilateral entre España e India. Y termino los agradecimientos, que no mi speech, con el profesor Raja Mohan. Thank you so much for being here. Es uno de los más respetados expertos mundiales en política exterior india. Ya el embajador le ha presentado, no voy a decir nada más. La Fundación agradece muchísimo que haya aceptado la invitación y estamos interesadísimos en los que nos puede contar hoy. Y siento a los que conocéis bien la Fundación Consejo España-India, pero tocan unos minutos de marketing, porque tenemos pocas oportunidades de contar lo que somos y lo que hacemos. Como sabéis, somos los responsables de este lanzamiento del observatorio. La Fundación Consejo España-India es una de las 8 fundaciones que tiene el Ministerio de Exteriores, que apoya e impulsa y que es fundamental para esa aproximación global a las relaciones bilaterales de los países que no son de la Unión Europea y que son prioritarios. Somos una plataforma de encuentros y contactos a todos los niveles. Nos apoyan empresas, instituciones públicas, organismos del Estado central, autonómico y local, universidades, escuelas de negocio y todas aquellas entidades que tienen intereses y que quieren defender sus intereses en la India. Y hace 2 años, en plena pandemia, decidimos acometer la elaboración de un informe que recogiera el estado de las relaciones bilaterales entre España y la India, un trabajo muy exhaustivo, global y actualizado que ha sido llevado a cabo con rigurosidad, transparencia y dando voz a todos los actores que tienen algo, públicos y privados, que tienen algo que decir en esa relación bilateral. Se identificaron 10 sectores de análisis y un total de 10 propuestas por cada sector que puedan contribuir a una nueva estrategia bilateral que ponemos a disposición de los responsables institucionales y de la sociedad civil. Para lograr hacer negocios en un país como la India, muy vasto, con una compleja estructura social y raíces culturales muy ricas y arraigadas, resulta imprescindible tener un conocimiento actualizado y amplio y profundo de sus singularidades. Esto es lo que hemos pretendido con el informe España-India en su conjunto. Que unos documentos complementen a otros y sirvan para describir el país y nuestras relaciones bilaterales con precisión y hondura de la manera amplia y cohesionada posible. Y como principal consecuencia y producto de este informe, hoy presentamos el Observatorio España-India, una plataforma virtual para impulsar las relaciones entre España e India desde el análisis, la reflexión y el diálogo bilateral, al tiempo que queremos que el observatorio sea un repositorio actualizado de la información y memoria bilateral que permitirá seguir fomentando el conocimiento mutuo, identificar oportunidades de cooperación y ofrecer recursos prácticos para que los principales actores bilaterales puedan fortalecer los intercambios entre ambos países. Esta necesidad de un instrumento como esta es clara. La ausencia de vínculos geográficos, políticos y económicos entre España e India ha dificultado que ambos países hayan podido encontrarse y conocerse, generando un déficit histórico y un potencial insatisfecho de intercambios bilaterales. Esta falta de conocimiento mutuo y la escasa masa crítica de actores bilaterales dificulta que las relaciones España-India cuenten con un impulso continuado y persistente desde la sociedad civil bilateral. Sin embargo, India hoy en día es, no solo como potencia geoestratégica y geoeconómica, sino también como mercado pujante y emprendedor y como sociedad joven y vibrante, uno de los principales actores globales. Y dada la actual sintonía política, la falta de irritantes estratégicos y las complementariedades y sinergias sectoriales entre España e India, es un momento idóneo para promover un diálogo bilateral que genere los instrumentos y recursos necesarios, acercando así a las instituciones y sociedades de ambos países. En unos instantes, el autor del informe y director del observatorio, Cristóbal Alvear, tendrá ocasión de poner en su conocimiento los fines, objetivos, iniciativas e instrumentos con los que cuenta para llevar a cabo este mayúsculo esfuerzo, para que cuenta con el indiscutible e imprescindible apoyo del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores, Unión Europea y Cooperación, para que una vez más me faltan las palabras de agradecimiento por su inestimable ayuda. Y nada más. Agradezco la existencia de todos y confío que el resultado de lo que hemos preparado pues os guste. Muchas gracias.
tomar la palabra el director general para América del Norte, Europa Oriental, Asia y Pacífico, Javier Salido, del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores. Iba a decir todo es largo, pero...
Muchas gracias. Director de la Fundación, embajador, presidente de la Fundación Consejo, patronos de la Fundación, amigos. Professor Mohan, it's a real pleasure to be here and to participate. I've been following your work since I was a political counselor in New Delhi over 12 years ago. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Es para mí un honor poder participar en este acto, en este magnífico auditorio. Me gustaría tener algo parecido en nuestro ministerio. Y me gustaría, en primer lugar, excusar la presencia de la Secretaria de Estado de Asuntos Exteriores y Globales, Ángeles Moreno Bau, a quien le hubiera encantado poder estar con nosotros hoy. La agenda siempre es complicada, pero no obstante sí querría reiterar el apoyo que ella siempre ha manifestado, al igual que el resto del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores, a la excelente labor de la Fundación Consejo España-India. Creo que ya bastante ha sido dicho sobre la importancia de la India y de las relaciones bilaterales en el contexto actual, un contexto internacional crecientemente geopolítico, tal como la actual invasión ilegal y sin ser provocada por parte de Rusia de Ucrania, en el que creemos que India debe de jugar un papel acorde con su peso, un papel además creciente y central en el ámbito Indo-Pacífico. El año 2023 ofrecerá excelentes oportunidades en nuestros dos países de seguir colaborando con la coincidencia de la presidencia india del G20 y la presidencia de España en la Unión Europea durante el segundo semestre del año. No obstante, me querría centrar en el evento que nos trae aquí hoy, que es el lanzamiento del Observatorio de India, España-India, que me proporciona la oportunidad de poner en valor, como decía, la propia existencia de la Fundación Consejo, que es impulsora del proyecto del propio observatorio y fuerza motriz de esta iniciativa. El Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores, Cooperación, Unión Europea, que aquí represento, apoya firmemente esta iniciativa. El lanzamiento del observatorio es un paso decisivo en esa profundización de las relaciones, que es el objetivo último de la Fundación. Tal como ha descrito ya el presidente de la Fundación, Juan Ignacio Entrecanales, hace un instante el valor y la proyección de la Fundación en el marco de la red de exteriores tiene establecida con los países de importancia estratégica fuera de la Unión Europea. La creación de esta fundación, que ya tiene más de 10 años de existencia, tuvo lugar en el año 2009 con la visita de Estado, la primera que tuvo lugar, de la presidenta Patil. Se trata de una plataforma de contactos y de relaciones entre el sector privado, las administraciones, el mundo cultural y el educativo, las universidades y los ámbitos de ciencia e innovación. En definitiva, todos los actores que pueden beneficiar de una actuación conjunta en defensa de sus legítimos intereses. Y como decía, uno de los proyectos más importantes de la Fundación, que se ha completado con éxito en los últimos años, ha sido la elaboración de este informe que cubre la totalidad de los sectores más relevantes que nutren nuestra rica relación entre España e India y, lo que es más importante, que contiene propuestas concretas de actuación que constituyen una ventana abierta al futuro. Producto de este informe es el propio observatorio que hoy presentamos y cuyos ejes ya han sido mencionados por el presidente Entrecanales y que serán desgranados además por el autor del informe y director del observatorio, Cristóbal Alvear, del que puedo dar fe es uno de los mayores expertos en India que existen en nuestro país. Tras el lanzamiento del informe tendrá lugar la presentación del observatorio y contaremos con la intervención del prestigioso profesor Mohan, que hablará sobre Europa y el Indo-Pacífico, una visión desde India. Será interesante su intervención y más en este momento tan complejo, como decía, en el que estamos viviendo en el mundo en general y en Europa en particular, y en el que el trabajo con India y la colaboración con este país resultan fundamentales. Muchas gracias.
Ahora va a tomar la palabra el embajador de India en España, Dinesh Patnaik. Embajador.
Thank you very much. It's always good to see friends here. I would have loved to speak in Spanish, but I still can't express myself that way. But I'll speak slowly for those who can't understand English. But I'm glad to see my good friend, President of the Spanish-India Foundation, Mr. Entrecanales, Javier Salido. We've always had some very interesting discussions. All the friends of the Spanish-India Council Foundation, former ambassadors. This is an initiative which, when I first came, the first meeting I had with the Spain-India Foundation, we decided how do we work to make the academic corridor between India and Spain more active. You know, there's a lot happening. We are having lots of work going on in trade, in business. We have defense deals. We have a whole lot of things happening in the Spain-India corridor. But there was not much interaction in the academic part, in the part in which you write about people, articles in newspapers, strategic articles. These things were not happening too much. And so one of the few things at that time, I think Cristobal was speaking about how planning to do an observatory. And I'm glad that within a short period of 9 months, we've been able to launch it. And this is all thanks to the great work done by the Spain-India Foundation with the new Secretary General who's come, who's bringing in more vigor. But this is not just the, the launch is not just the end of things. This is just the beginning of a lot of things we are planning. One is, of course, this observatory, which will look at different aspects of Spain-India relations. But more than different aspects, there are certain things which we want to do, which is planning to take it to all the universities in Spain, get all the international relations departments in universities in Spain to write, because this is an online platform, a platform where people can write. Of course, we will select who writes. It's not a question of anybody can write. Also get universities in India to start writing, because it's only when universities, journalists, strategic writers, people like Raja Mohan, Nirmala, who write on issues, when they start contributing to writing about Spain-India, will you create a body of knowledge which will help in taking the relationship much forward? And this is what we are going to do. Apart from this, there are a lot of other discussions which we need to have, which is on the Indo-Pacific, the rise of the Indo-Pacific. Spain has been slightly behind. Spain always had good intentions, but it was always slightly behind. If you really know, the route to India was the Spanish initiative. Unfortunately, Columbus landed up in the other side of the world. He had the right way of coming. But if he would have continued the way Magellan went, Magellan died in the Philippines, but Elcano continued his journey around the world. But the normal way the Elcano did it was through the Indo-Pacific. That was the center of the world. If you look back to more than 200 years before, starting from the Egyptian Empire to about 200 years before, the center of the world trade was the Indo-Pacific. Everything happened there. Global trade started in the Indo-Pacific. And so today, it is a return back to yesterday. It's not a new thing. It is a back to the future kind of a situation where the world trade, world population, world dynamics is all centered around the Indo-Pacific. Later on, we will hear Professor Raja Mohan speak about it. But this observatory is also a window into the Indo-Pacific through India, which is what I like, because this is what it should be, because it's the only ocean in the world named after a country, which is India. And so to have an observatory which looks at the Indo-Pacific through India, taking all dimensions, political, economic, commercial, arts, culture, everything together, this is what we are looking at. So thank you very much for launching this today. We will launch it soon. And it's a great initiative, and there will be complete support from the Embassy of India and the Government of India for anything that we are looking at and doing this. Thank you very much.
Toma la palabra ahora Cristóbal Alvear, director del Observatorio, colaborador de la Fundación y, como decía el director, para mí también el mayor experto de India.
The Director General, President of Spain-India Council Foundation, His Excellency Ambassador of Spain to India, Professor Raja Mohan, Ms. Nirmala Raja Mohan, Director of the Fundación Ramón Areces, dear members of the Indo-Spanish civil society, although our President has already stated it, allow me to start by reiterating our thanks to the Director of the Fundación Ramón Areces and his team for hosting us today and for all great support given to put this event together. The fact that today we are launching the Spain-India Observatory as a follow-up or a spin-off of the Spain-India 2020 report confirms the commitment of the Spain-India Council Foundation with the strengthening of the Indo-Spanish relations in close cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation of Spain, and of course with the Embassy of India in Spain. I would like to spur my sincere gratitude to the President and to the team of the Spain-India Council Foundation, to Ramon, to Berta, to Vega and Mikel for their continued support to make this project possible and to trust me once again its direction. Among the various outcomes of the Spain-India 2020 report, that I guess it is the main reason I am here today with you, Spain-India Observatory has been established to continue with this joint reflection made. Today we are launching this fascinating project that targets three main goals. First, the creation of a dynamic platform for the monitoring of Spain-India relations. Second, the generation of updated and accessible information and bilateral knowledge for fostering mutual awareness and understanding. And finally, the promotion of a networking space open to all experts, researchers, and institutions, as the ambassador said. As a platform that is going to have, as we say in Spain, one foot in the virtual world, but also the other one in the daily reality of Indo-Spanish relations, Spain-India Observatory will focus its efforts on thematic year programs for tailor-made analysis and information. The Spain-India Observatory first year of activities will be devoted to exploring the main pathways for Indo-Spanish relations within the framework of the Indo-Pacific from several perspectives. The first obvious approach would be the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Second one, within the EU strategy, but also beyond, would consist of the analysis of potential bilateral and multilateral capacity building partnership in sectors where India and Spain share not only common interests, but also technological synergies, such as the digital Indo-Pacific, the maritime Indo-Pacific, or the sustainable Indo-Pacific. Finally, the Observatory will explore the ways Spain and India can partner together in fostering a conversation between Latin American and the Indo-Pacific. With the aim of making these dialogues as fruitful as possible, the Observatory will generate both a concept paper prior to the dialogues, as the introductory one that you have with you today in the folder, and an outcome paper with the significant reflection share during these dialogues. These papers do not intend to be exhaustive, but to be accessible for all readers, as well as to provide a snapshot of the main facts and ideas for bilateral ideas of the main topics we are going to discuss. Furthermore, sector-based Spain-India guides for bilateral cooperation would be also elaborated this year, targeting economics of the language and university cooperation. On the occasion of the visit of key Indian experts, several activities on the emergence will be organized, as we have scheduled for Professor Raja Mohan during this week, to create a greater impact. Finally, Spanish and Indian experts will be welcome to contribute with article or analysis on the Indo-Spanish partnership within the Indo-Pacific framework. Allow me to take advantage of this opportunity to extend my invitation to all experts and researchers present with here us today. Professor Raja Mohan has honored us with his participation in the launching of the Spain-India Observatory. I am personally always checking his weekly column at the Indian Express and the Indian Express for understanding what India's vision of the world is. But not this week. This week we have the opportunity of directly ask him about it. Thank you, Professor Mohan. Thank you, Ms. Nirmala Raja Mohan, for making the effort of traveling from India to Spain to join us this week. And again, I'm really terribly sorry of the weather. It's not the real Madrid. I leave the floor to the Secretary General of the Spain-India Council Foundation, Mr. Ramón Molero, who will introduce you to Professor Raja Mohan.
Buenos días, good morning. Thank you, Cristobal, for this presentation. President of the Spain-India Council Foundation, Director General, Ambassador, Professor, dear trustees of the Foundation, dear friends. It is a great honor and a privilege for me to introduce you to Professor Raja Mohan. I had the opportunity of hosting him in Barcelona in 2012 when I was director of Casa Asia. Anyone who has the fortune of living in India, as I had, knows that Professor Mohan is one of India's leading commentators and opinion makers. But Professor Mohan is also very well known among readers of global media. Journalists from leading newspapers usually call Professor Mohan to check their views on India's role in the world before writing their articles. And so we did. We have called Professor Mohan to ask for his opinion on India's vision of the Indo-Pacífico and the role of Europe in the region. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. As well, you have his CV in the different papers we have distributed, but Professor Raja Mohan has lately shared his time between India and Singapore, and he's currently senior fellow with the Asia Society Policy Institute in New Delhi, and earlier he was the director of Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore, where he's still associate as visiting research professor. Professor Mohan has also taught South Asian Studies at GNU University in New Delhi and at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And his career has been extensively linked to the world of think tanks. He has been associated with several Indian think tanks, including the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, the Center for Policy Research, and the Observatorio Research Foundation. He was also the founding director of Carnegie India and chair in international affairs at the Henry Kissinger at the United States Library of the Congress. But his expertise cover Asian geopolitics, Indian foreign and security policies, and the global governance of new technologies. He has different books, and allow me to highlight some of them. For instance, Samudra Manthan, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, Modi's World, Expanding India's Sphere of Influence, and the New Asian Geopolitics, Military Power, Regional Order. So Professor Mohan is indeed the right person to enlighten us on India's vision on the Indo-Pacific and the role of Europe. I'm sure that we will learn quite a lot about the subject through his speech. So we are now just to pass the floor to Professor Mohan. And well, after that, I will open the floor for different questions from the audience. So Professor Raja, my friend, please, thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Good morning. It's really wonderful to be here this morning with all of you. And let me begin by really thanking Berta Fuertes, Cristobal Alvear, and Mike Herrera for actually facilitating our visit. Me and my wife been working with them very closely over the last 1 month, and it's been wonderful coming here. Thank you for the warm and wonderful hospitality and putting together such a fine program where we can engage with this distinguished audience and the institutions that they represent to promote greater engagement between Spain and India in the coming years. Because we'll blame the Pope for giving the East to Portugal, but now I believe there is a lot more possibility in a world that is shrinking, where Spain and Europe today are really welcome by India to play a much larger role in this part of the world. So let me begin by thanking him and a whole lot of you here. Mr. Raimundo Pérez-Hernández, Director of the Fundación Ramón Areces, please, let me apologize for my Spanish pronunciation. Mr. Juan Ignacio Entrecanales, Javier Salido from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Dinesh Patnaik, Sir Ramon Moreno, who's my friend. He hosted me 10 years ago in Barcelona. Thank you again for the generous introduction today. And congratulations to Cristobal Alvia for starting the Spanish-India Observatory. Now, when I looked at the concept paper that they presented, actually, it's such an impressive paper. Everything that you want to know and were afraid to ask about the Indo-Pacific and India, it's all there. I think in a fairly good detail. So I'm not going to trace that broad generalities. I would strongly recommend this paper for all our Spanish friends to take a look at that paper, because I think it really lays out the broader framework of what is going on. What I thought I'll do is really to offer some context in which today Spain and India are beginning to engage on the Indo-Pacific and engage and expand their bilateral engagement through the prism of the European Union on the one hand and the Indo-Pacific geography on the other. This really today, if you look at the world today, we are at an inflection point, really at a moment where many of the traditional assumptions about the world are beginning to shake down. If somebody has told us 2 years ago, Europe would be seeing a conventional war of such ferocity, of such brutality that we're seeing in Ukraine, it would have shocked, for no one would have believed us. But today, there we are, right in the heart of the world's most, one of the richest civilizations and one of the most advanced societies. We're seeing a horrible war in the middle of Europe. We're also beginning to see, and I think what the war in Ukraine has done, has really tended to accelerate many of the trends that already existed in the international system. Over the last decade, we're beginning to see the breakdown of the great power relations for nearly 30-odd years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. We had actually a relative harmony among all the major powers, that US, China, Japan, Russia, Europe, everyone seemed to get along with everyone else, and the focus was on business. But today, that period of harmony between the major powers is broken down into actual war in Europe, and a potential war in Asia, where a China that might take lessons from Russian aggression, and if Russia certainly gets away with it in Europe, I would certainly bet there will be quite an incentive for China to take over Taiwan. So I think what we're seeing is really the return of the great power rivalry, the return of warfare as a serious option between the major powers in the international system. A second trend that was already visible during the pandemic and before that over the last decade is really the tendency to deglobalize. For nearly 30-odd years, we really had, all of us believed that globalization was irreversible, ineluctable, and it is only a matter of detail how different countries in different regions adapt to this supranatural force of globalization that was going to crush everything together into a single kind of an order, both economic and geopolitical. But what we've seen happen last 10 years, and I think it's going to be accelerated after the war in Ukraine and the pandemic, is the beginning of I wouldn't say total deglobalization, but a more measured form of economic interaction, where the need to say, for example, globalization was focused on efficiency, that you move production where it is most efficient to produce. And that rest did not matter. It's a question of opening up the doorways to capital, free movement of capital and labor across the boundaries of nation states, and that capital will actually perform better with a superior fashion, and that trade and that economic integration would produce peace. But today, we're moving from an emphasis on efficiency to resilience. We saw the methodology by which globalization and interdependence was misused, weaponized by China during the pandemic. Today, we need resilience, and it's not just efficiency. There will be cost associated with it. But for societies, for politicians, for leaders across the world, resilience is as important today as efficiency was. We are moving again from what we used to call just-in-time delivery or production to just-in-case. That is, if there is the events that disturb the supply chains, we need to reframe how we think about supply chains, how we think about collaborations across borders, from the belief that it did not matter where we produced as long as the supply chains operated, to one where the emphasis on trusted partners, reliable supply chains, and friendshoring, as our friends in America call it, nearshoring, to one of simply either exporting capital, exporting labor, or importing capital and importing labor. Those conditions are fundamentally changing. A third feature, I would say, in the context is really the weakening of international institutions. We know that when one of the permanent members is at war, the UN Security Council can do very little. We have two of them together, that is Russia and China today have an alliance. That's going to make it a lot harder to believe that the Security Council can actually produce outcomes that are in favor of the entire world. On the WTO today, the belief in 2000 that WTO would transform the global economy to one where because there are different groups, within the Western world, who feel that globalization has cost the people of some of the developing world. In the past, we used to say, look, in the developing countries, we say North is imposing WTO on us, but today, a lot of people in the United States, we saw that in Britain and in Europe as well, feel that globalization has consequences. Therefore, the WTO of the kind that we imagined in the early 90s, certainly after China's entrance in 2000, 2001, today that's being reconsidered in very, very fundamental basis. So institutional weakness, measure of deglobalization, and renewed great power contestation, these are the broad features in which today we talk about the potential importance of the Indo-Pacific. If you look at the Indo-Pacific, really, should Europe be bothered about Indo-Pacific when you have a war going on right in the middle of Europe? But there in Madrid, just 6 months ago, we had the NATO summit, which was attended by 3 Asian countries for the first time. You had Prime Minister of Japan, the President of South Korea, and the Prime Minister of Australia coming all the way from Asia to attend for the first time a NATO summit. And for NATO's own declaration begins to talk about the importance of the Indo-Pacific for European security. So Asia is not some faraway place, and that Europe, which is has great luxury of looking inwards in the last 30 years, or simply focus on business, mostly in China, to one where you have to deal with the complexities of Asia or the Indo-Pacific in more fundamental terms, and I think that realization is beginning to dawn. And if you look at the National Security Strategy document issued by the United States a few weeks ago, it says, look, there is war in Europe, but Russia is a short-term threat, while China is the long-term challenger to the Western civilization, to Western order, to Western institutions. So in spite of the war, right in the middle of the war, this document frames it quite clearly that the long-term challenge is China, while the near-term threat is Russia. And I think for the Europeans really have to come to terms with this. And I'm quite happy to note both the European Union and before that, many European countries individually have issued guidelines on the Indo-Pacific. Of course, France is a resident power in the Indo-Pacific. They're pretty active here in the Indo-Pacific. We saw Germany, Netherlands, and other countries issue. Most recently, it was Canada. Of course, Canada is not in part of Europe, but it's part of NATO. And we have the European Union itself outlining a strategy. In fact, as we talk today, Brussels today is hosting a major ASEAN leaders. So this is also probably a first time that EU is actually hosting the ASEAN summit. So in many ways, Europe is going to be engaged with Asia in ways in which you were not before. But I might say, as Ambassador Patnaik would confirm, our current foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar, devotes attention to Europe. Probably no foreign minister I've known. I've covered the Indian Foreign Office for nearly 3.5 decades, and my engagement with Mr. Patnaik, Ambassador Patnaik, goes back to at least 3 decades. That for the first time today, you have Delhi paying serious attention to Europe, because for Indian calculations, Europe becomes quite central to India's own security and to the stability and the long-term prosperity of Asia. And I think that's what I would like to explore with you today. So what I would do in the next half an hour or so is to really look at 5 broad themes, which lend some insight into the paper that you already have in your hands that has been prepared by the Observatory. One is the concept of the Indo-Pacific. I think many friends are surprised, even in Asia, where I lived in Singapore for many years. They say, look, how have we got Indo into the Pacific? This is the question, look, whereas, because many ASEAN friends, the Chinese and Russians, of course, go ballistic when you mention Indo-Pacific. They say it's all Asia-Pacific, because that's what we know. And Indo-Pacific is a new American construct, and that is not acceptable. So we'll look at the concept of the Indo-Pacific, how it has emerged. We'll also look at the nature of the changing balance of power. That's the second thing I want to talk about in Asia. And the third is how the shifting institutional framework of Asian security that's beginning to unfold. The old institutions like ASEAN are not able to cope with the new challenges, and you have new institutions like Quad, AUKUS that have emerged, and we can talk about some of that. And the growing salience of India in the new Indo-Pacific order that is emerging. And I'll conclude with a broad assessment of where India and Europe can work together for the long-term security of the Indo-Pacific. So firstly, the term Indo-Pacific, look, I think many of us think geography is a fixed thing. Thanks to climate change, nothing is fixed these days. But regional names, regional monikers are really politically constituted. They're not fixed terms. When Britain was the center of the universe, there was something called the Far East, there was something called the Near East, depending on how far you were. And the way we think about these regions, just in the last 70, 80 years, how much names have changed in Asia. For example, the word Southeast Asia was used only in 1943 when Britain lost Singapore and Malaya, and they set up the so-called Southeast Asia Command. Till then, there was no term called Southeast Asia. There was India, there was Further Indies, as the Indonesians were called, there was Japan, there was China, there was Indochina. There was no Southeast Asia till it was invented under a specific circumstance by the British military as it retreated from Asia. East Asia. When did this term start? We knew there was Southeast Asia, there was Northeast Asia. That was easy to divide that. But where did East Asia come from? If you go back to a World Bank report in 1991 or 92, where it said the East Asian economic miracle. So somebody, smart guy in World Bank, decided Southeast Asia is growing, Northeast Asia has grown. The original Japan-led, the flying geese formation now has included ASEAN. Therefore, there's a whole integrating East Asian economic sphere. And partly, it was also about China's economic opening up. And then we get the term Asia-Pacific. Again, it was a 90s invention. Till then, there was no such thing as Asia-Pacific because, you brought the Americans in as the US and China began to integrate. If we can have the west coast of Latin America part of the Pacific and the Asia-Pacific, why is it so shocking to have India in the Indo-Pacific? Because if you go back to the Second World War, there were 2 million Indian soldiers in the Second World War. So normally it's always presented as a European conflict when our dear British friends, there was no British army, there was really a British Indian army that fought both in the First World War, 1 million troops in the First World War. Indian troops were right here in Northern Europe, in France, in Belgium, fighting for the right side in Europe. And in the Second World War too, it was the Indian army that had hand-to-hand combat with the Japanese, pushed the Japanese out of Burma. It was the Indian army that took surrender of the Japanese troops in Rangoon, in Singapore, in Jakarta, and in Hanoi. So the centrality of India and Indian resources was a deep reality until the Second World War. But then something happened. Of course, India turned inwards, and the new Americans rose, and the division of the region into South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Northeast Asia was really an artificial construct. Or the idea that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean were two different oceans. But if you live in Singapore, you see the two oceans converge there. If you go to the Opium Wars, opium was grown in India, sold in China, Chinese East Coast, and it was all about Britain actually using India as a base to expand its engagement with East Asia, with China. So I think the artificial geographic framing really tends to detract us from seeing the interconnections. After all, the seas, for example, cannot be separated. Seas, the world's ocean bodies, are a single sphere. So the notion that these are separate zones was really, some academic convenience is needed because you can't teach everything at the same time. And some of the foreign offices love to keep divisions made so that you can divide your work. But I believe the Director General has almost a Napoleonic sphere of influence out there, covering almost the entire world. But the fact is that the Indo-Pacific is really about the growth of China and the emergence of India, which are fundamentally changing the geographies. Today, China has presence in the Indian Ocean. And our American friends and the Japanese friends believe having India in the Pacific is critical for the construction of a new, secure regional architecture. So that's what has changed. So this is not a school geography teacher telling us how you think about the world, but really about the transformations, emerging new powers like China and India, and their impact on the regional spaces that are beginning to emerge. And I think, therefore, what we have is really Indo-Pacific as a new geography is here to stay. I mean, it took a long time, for more than a decade, for this idea to be established. Initially promoted by the Americans, but by withdrawn. Later, you had the Japanese, actually. The late Shinzo Abe was really the one who really promoted this idea that the two oceans were together. Then our Australian friends, Indonesian friends, and eventually India have all accepted this format. But there it is today, the Indo-Pacific as a geography. That doesn't mean we don't think of the subregions within it. There is Western Indian Ocean, there is the Arabian Sea, there is the Bay of Bengal, there is the South China Sea, there is the East China Sea. But I think the interconnections between these zones today is a reality. And that is the reality we're trying to grapple with in a strategic sense by talking about the Indo-Pacific as a framing device in which, after all, if you go to Europe, I don't know how Europeans agree on where Europe begins and where it ends, roughly perhaps in Urals, but there is a lot more complexity within Europe itself. I mean, where the divisions lay, how far you can think of Europe as a single entity. There were religious divides. Maybe it was the Christendom or later Orthodox part of Europe. Is it part of Europe or not? So I think, so we shouldn't let those kind of regions. What we have is really economic force today, rise of China, smashing together large parts of the Indian Ocean into the Chinese economic sphere. I mean, if the Chinese have a military base in Djibouti, where historically the Arabian Peninsula was dominated by the West, but today you saw the Xi Jinping's summit last week in meeting all the Arabs. So what you have is really a structural change that is emerging, and I think dealing with the structural change is the key thing. The second, but I want to talk about the change of the balance of power. That within a generation, we've seen China rise from being a mere economic power to a powerful military actor. I mean, I think Today, China, second largest economy, close to $15 trillion, second only to the US. The military expenditure, close to $300 billion, makes it the second largest military power as well. This rise of China has profoundly altered the regional balance. Because until recently we thought, look, the Americans' dominance in the Pacific was going to be a permanent feature. If you look at the map, Americans are sitting on the so-called first island chain, running from the north of Japan, those islands, the disputed islands, the Senkakus, to Japan, which is actually is an archipelagic state, a long archipelagic state. Then you have the Philippines, then you have Taiwan, then you have Southeast Asia. But the Americans were on the dominant position all along this chain. But a China that has risen, has military capabilities today, is telling Uncle Sam, time to go home. That there was a time when Mao Zedong was supposed to have said, look, right now the Americans are snoring next to my bed. I don't like it. I would rather, but at this point, I can't push him out. But today, Xi Jinping thinks the snoring man next to you with his military buzzing around you can be sent home. And then the confidence that has come from the American military capabilities, Chinese military capabilities, land-based missile force, an expanding navy. Probably we've never seen the kind of speed of construction of naval capabilities. So what we are seeing is, of course, Americans still spend $1 trillion of defense, while the Chinese spend only $250. But what is not changing is the global balance, but the regional balance of power between the United States and China is fundamentally altering. Because Americans have to come 10,000 miles away to stay on the front yard of China to be able to produce the balance. But today, Chinese missile capabilities, its naval capabilities today, can threaten the American forward military presence. Right in Europe, American presence in Europe has what has guaranteed peace, kept Russia in check. But Russia thought they can push the Americans out, they discovered they can't. But in the Chinese case, Americans come from a long way. And as the military balance shifts between US and China within the first island chain, Chinese capacity to change territorial status quo has begun to unfold. And that's the reason why what we saw happen in South China Sea since 2012. I think Ambassador Patnaik has also served in Cambodia, where the Chinese unilateral change of territorial status quo, Chinese attempt to change unilateral territorial status quo in the Himalayas, in the Senkakus on a daily basis, they're forcing Japan to scramble to defend themselves in the situation. So what you have is, today the shifting economic power and the shifting military balance of power has given China powerful advantages in the region. So what the Chinese are doing is really tell Americans, look, we are big boys. We're the two new great powers. Let's settle this between ourselves. Don't let the local powers tell you. I know the Europeans know that feeling when Russians and the Americans talk to each other. So here, a lot of the sense that, look, the big boys can do a deal on Ukraine. I mean, a lot of people keep talking about it, but I don't think it's going to happen. But in the case of the Chinese are telling the Americans, look, you come from far away. If you want any problem, I can help you. But why don't you leave this region, go back, and that we can jointly manage the region if need be. And then the Chinese tell their neighbors, look, Uncle Sam is far away. He can't secure you. He can't protect you. I'm here and I'm growing, I'm rising. It's in your interest to accept the terms that the benign emperor in Beijing will offer you. But if you don't take it, we're going to push you around. So that is the shift that is produced. And here I think a lot of our friends who talk about rise of Asia don't see, and then the framing, it is Asia versus the West, East versus the West. Asia has risen, but within Asia, different countries have risen at different paces. That's a very important thing to remember. It's not just Asia rising, but China has risen faster than its neighbors. It's overtook Japan as the #1 economy in Asia about 10 years ago. Today, its economy is almost 5 times larger than India's. So therefore, the idea that it's not Asia as a collective that has risen against the East, but a lot of us in the East, we love this, Asia is rising, West is gone, age of Vasco da Gama is gone and all that stuff. But there are contradictions within Asia. which we normally don't talk about. And today, what China has done, China's unilateral attempt at changing status quo tells us is Asia has its own internal contradictions, and there many see the importance of a long-term American presence in this part of the world. That is in the Indo-Pacific. Even our own India, which traditionally opposed American presence in Asia and the Indian Ocean today, sees we work with the Americans. Vietnam, which is a communist country, which has very close ties to China, would rather have the Americans around rather than leave you at the mercy of the Chinese. Japan, which thought, like Indians for a long time, if you're nice to everybody, everybody's nice to you. And Japan discovers, actually, if you're nice doesn't mean the other guy is going to be nice to you, where Chinese believe that it is their claims are just. You could argue with that. But they think they have the capacity to redeem those historic claims, whether it's in Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh. Last week we had clashes again. And with the Japanese in the East China Sea, South China Sea, of course, they say the whole South China Sea should be a Chinese lake. So I think there you are, that China's relative weight vis-a-vis its neighbors has given it the confidence and the belief that the West is in decline, probably terminal, but as a discovery in Ukraine, probably a premature conclusion, but nevertheless, the belief that the West is in decline and that China's hegemony in Asia can be secured easily. And I think that is what is being challenged today with the emergence of new regional institutions. And that's where I'll come to as a third point, which is really, when we had the idea of, for example, ASEAN, go back to the 90s, there was only ASEAN, which steadily expanded its institutional basis. From ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, the East Asia Summit. So ASEAN seemed to be the fulcrum around which you could build new regional institutions. But today we know ASEAN is deeply, deeply divided. You have Cambodia and Laos, 5 million people or less, living under the shadow of the Chinese. I mean, you don't expect them to resist what the Chinese do, either, individually. And ASEAN itself cannot stand up for Philippines and Vietnam, who lost territories to Chinese use of military force. Here you have a situation where in the PCA, Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, Chinese lost the argument on South China Sea on every single count that the Filipinos had gone to the court. The unanimous judgment opposing Chinese claims in the South China Sea. But what does the Philippines president do? He says, look, I can't fight the Chinese. So I'd rather accept the Chinese dominance, look for his benevolence, hope like he can do a deal with me. So the belief that was so overwhelming power that you cannot really contest it, and there you saw the ASEAN today cannot stand up for its members, let alone for the others. And within its institution, the Chinese power, the Chinese shadow, begins to weaken the ASEAN as an institution. So therefore, what you have is really the creation of new institutions. The Quadrilateral Forum, which had set up in 2007, died very early death. Since 2017, we've seen the Quad return as a forum. Our ASEAN friends don't like it. They worry that it might undermine ASEAN centrality. But there you are. Quad is now a reality, and it's going to operate in the region, not as a counter to ASEAN, but as a supplement, because ASEAN can't do the kind of things that the Quad wants to do. And then you have the AUKUS, even though British friends are back, so it's a good lesson for the Europeans. Please come back to Asia. That Australia, UK, and the US working together to support the nuclear powered submarine program in Australia, and a whole range of other technologies. So you have then the old institutional framework, which seemed adequate, is breaking up, and that there are new institutions. And of course, our Chinese friends don't like it. They have this thing called 5-4-3-2-1, which is they hate this 5-4-3-2-1, football-like combination. 5 being the 5 eyes, the intelligence establishments of US, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. Then you have the 4, which is the Quad. Then you have the 3, which is the AUKUS. Then you have 2, which is the American bilateral alliances. And then the US, the evil itself. So therefore, 5-4-3-2-1, a combination is what they want to break up and not let it emerge. But I think my sense is where the Chinese probably, like President Putin in Europe, President Xi too has miscalculated fundamentally that rest of Asia would simply acquiesce in China's domination. And I think what we've seen in the last few years is, whether it's India, whether it is Japan, whether it is Australia, people are not going to simply roll over just because Chinese think their moment in the sun has come. So I think this is important here. This notion that, many of our European and the Western friends think, Chinese nationalism is very strong, we have to find a way of dealing. But China is not the only nationalist in Asia. Everybody is a nationalist. After all, we're all recently decolonized. There's no shortage of nationalism, xenophobia, you name it. So the notion that rest of Asia must accommodate to Chinese nationalism, you can't convince the Indians on that. You can't convince a lot of the Japanese on it, nor can you convince the Indonesians on it. Not even the Burmese, who today are very close to the Chinese, that there is deep nationalism, and the Chinese claim that people would simply accept it. And what we've seen is they're finding alternatives, both in terms of new coalitions like the Quad, strengthening alliances, those who have alliances with the United States, building up their military capabilities. For example, everybody's looking for submarines in Asia. As it turns out, interestingly, only the Europeans sell submarines. Americans don't sell. And if you look at Europe, you have, let's start with Sweden, sells submarines. Spain, I believe, makes submarines. You have France, of course. You have Germany. You have, so you have actually the only submarines for sale from Europe. That tells you potentially that Europe still has a role. That is. I'll come back to that in the final section. So coming to India, as I said, there's the fourth point, where why is India so critical to this region? So I would say that, in fact, the Indo-Pacific is about putting India into the Pacific. Otherwise, there's no case for the Indo-Pacific. Because after all, Japan and South Korea, Australia are treaty allies of the United States. If they wanted to do something in the region, they could have done exactly with the treaty allies. It's much easier, because a lot of times friends say, India is the weak link of the Quad. But the fact is, it is India that makes the Quad a real institution. Because it's only non-treaty ally non-treaty partner in the Quad. So this is about bringing the Indian mass into the balancing equation in the Indo-Pacific. That's what the Second World War was about. As I said, I mentioned, that it is the Indian resources that produced the victories for the Allies in Asia and in a broader sense. That today, without India, you cannot construct a stable equilibrium within the Indo-Pacific. So why do the Americans are willing to cut slack for India and Ukraine? Why do they think they don't attack us very much? Because they say, look, the longer-term challenge in the Indo-Pacific can only be addressed in partnership with India, which is not a treaty ally, which is an independent actor. But what has facilitated India's willingness today to work with the United States is our Chinese friends. Because, Indians for a long time, non-aligned, not willing to take sides, as a lot of people say, between India and China. But today, Chinese have pushed us 4 military crises: 2013, 2014, 2017, 2020. I don't know if another one is brewing right now. We see things happening in Arunachal Pradesh right now as we speak. So therefore, for India, which was reluctant to engage the West on security issues, today is deeply committed to recognizing the importance of partnership with the US in order to produce a balance of power in the region. And I think that is a huge shift in the way India looks at the world. From an India that said Western powers should get out of the Indian Ocean, Western powers should have nothing to do with it, we, Asian brothers, will be happy to get along with each other if only the terrible West leaves us alone. But then, as most of Asia has discovered, if the West leaves you alone, there you have local hegemons ready to take charge. So this notion that somehow we are going to get along if we can just send the West home is fundamentally mistaken. After all, within Asia, there is no shortage of ambitions. And I think the Chinese, Xi Jinping, has demonstrated that kind of an ambition. And I think this has today sees India looking to the deeper partnership with the US through the Quad and through a whole range of forums to stabilize it. So our interest in stability and security in Asia today are in convergence with the American interests to secure in Asia through new forms. It's not just NATO. It's not just American bilateral alliances in Asia. You need new forms to cope with the scale and intensity of Chinese power, which is phenomenal. So this can't be done through ASEAN. This can't be done through bilateral alliances. You need a different coalition, and that coalition can only be built in partnership with India. So that's the reason why you have actually the Quad that emerges. And here, I think if you read the national security strategy clearly, the last point I want to make, where the US emphasizes, while there are two theaters, the US wants greater cooperation between its allies in Europe and its partners in Asia. That's the reason why you had Japan, Korea, Australia present at the NATO summit. That is because China and Russia today have signed an alliance with no limits. Therefore, if Europe wants to be secure, it needs greater partnership with Asia. And if Asia and the Indo-Pacific wants to be secure, we need the Europeans to play a larger role. What kind of a role? Because Europe says, it used to say, we're empire of norms. We don't do this bad military stuff. The Americans can do all the dirty stuff. We talk the big stuff. But today, I think, as you see the consequences of the Russian action and the potential positions that China can take, Europe needs to chip in, not only to secure itself, but also to help Asia secure itself. We know that, there was a famous saying, Stalin was supposed to have asked, how many divisions does the Pope have? It's not how many armies that you have, how many ships you can deploy in the South China Sea or the Indian Ocean. Europe can bring moral power on the normative issues, for example, on the law, on the question of South China Sea. We would like to see Europe speak with much stronger voice. We'd like Europe to see the same sovereignty violation that is taking place in Ukraine is taking place on a daily basis in Ladakh, in the Himalayas, in the South China Sea, and in the East China Sea. So bringing Europe's moral weight, its normative power to deal with situations in Asia, I think would be very, very helpful. And then the capabilities-wise, Europe, I believe, has a lot to offer. As I said, submarines was just one example, but a range of technologies. If it is a question of making chips, without the Dutch machines, you can't make chips. A range of European technologies today. So I think there is today Europe that is outward-looking, looks beyond its own integration, recognizes the consequence of change that is taking place in Indo-Pacific, can play a larger role in this part of the world. Here, India, as I mentioned, India today spends a lot of time on Europe, and India that sees Europe has a critical role in shaping the balance in Asia. Because in the end, Asia should not be put at the mercy of just US and China. And that Europe, as a third pole, has to play a role in shaping the structure in this part of the world. And I think if you go back 400 years, when the Spanish and the Portuguese explorers came out, they didn't see these were different parts. So as a global economy, as we connect to each other, a stronger presence of Europe in this part of the world, not necessarily through military means, through technological means, through normative pressures, and finally through building the capacities of individual Asian countries. I think this is the greatest contribution Europe can make for Indo-Pacific, but the first step is to pay attention, engage us, do more in Europe. At least there was a time when we all said Europe was colonial and we don't want anything to do with Europe, and Europeans thought they were colonial thing was gone and we're not going to do anything in Asia. But today, we need all of Europe to chip in individually, bilaterally, as well as collectively to produce peace and stability in Asia. And here I think, whether it is the global gateway projects or other things, for example, this is my final thought, as we look ahead, we say, look, Chinese BRI is a kind of a superlative genius that has kind of unfolded. But who built the Suez Canal? It was the Europeans that built it. And Chinese haven't done anything as spectacular as the Suez Canal. If you look at all the great cities of Asia, Shanghai, Singapore, Hong Kong, Bombay, Delhi, these are all built in partnership with the Europeans. Yes, it was the colonial age, but Europe's engagement with Asia, you can, it's not just the colonial period. You can go back to the Gandhara period where the Greece engagement with India and Spain's own engagement with Africa and the Middle East. So we have a longer history. So I think the colonial moment is over. I don't think in India we are burdened by it. You should not be burdened by it. Let's take a fresh look at how we can work together to make the world more secure and by making Indo-Pacific more secure. So I'll stop here, and if there are any questions, we can take it.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mohan, for sharing your ideas about Europe and the Indo-Pacific. It has been quite interesting, your keynote speech, with lots of interesting things, especially, well, you have mentioned Europe is a third pole, you have to count on Europe as well, and the importance of the changing in geographical context, especially taking into account that now there's the new concept of Indo-Pacific, and in the past it was Asia-Pacific. But, well, this is the period of questions and answers, so I pass the floor to the audience. Is there any question about, okay, President? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor. The lecture was fantastic. I'm many new things for me, so I learned a lot. Mm-hmm. I noted down, which I'm going to make it mine, going from just in time to just in case is what we're doing in Acción, I have to say, looking for new supply chains. I would like to, if you could, talk a little bit about supply chains. And then, which is a question out of the blue, do you think there's going to be in the near future a peace treaty in Ukraine, Russia? Guess. Well, thank you.
Go ahead, yes.
Europe stabilize, because immediately they also pay impacts. It's not just Europeans. As Ambassador Patnaik, I'm sure, tells you the cost of oil, fertilizers, all that is back to us. The first question, I mean, in terms of supply chains, it's really, I think we're beginning to adapt. I think most countries are beginning to adapt. Most US and the Western companies are talking about a China plus one strategy. I think that was already there before Ukraine. But today, I think the question is gaining ground. Vietnam has gained a lot of investment coming out of China. But I think India has a lot of work to do. We need to make it easier for other companies to come in, invest in India, to be part of a new supply chain arrangements. I think what Apple is doing in India is one example. If Apple can succeed in India, I'm sure it'll be easier for Ambassador Patnaik to tell everyone, but if Apple can do it, which has a crazy specifications and a whole lot of demands, if India becomes the center for Apple's production, hopefully that will convince a lot more companies in Europe and America to say, come to India, the environment is cheap. But of course, India has to do a lot more to make it easier for the world to invest. And I think, but this is going to happen. The question is speed and pitch and how different countries adapt.
Thank you. It's okay. The microphone.
Thank you, Professor. It was really very interesting. In a few weeks, India is holding the presidency of the G20. G20 is, as everybody knows, it was born at an economic crisis. It was later on forgotten. It was revived at the economic crisis of the 2010, and now it has come again on special focus with the economic crisis and the political crisis. How do you foresee the leadership of India for the next very important 12 months with your presidency of the G20, and how do you think your authorities are going to hold this presidency? Thank you.
Well, I would say it's a huge opportunity, but it's also a terrible challenge to do a large multilateral institution at this point in time. Because, as I said, multilateralism is at a crisis. We see the UN Security Council blocked on the Ukrainian question. We can't get Russia into the same room, or even sit there for too long a time, because the Lavrov walks out quickly. That at the end of Jakarta summit, producing a piece of paper that says a sentence which everybody can live with, that's become the achievement of. So I think we are in a deep crisis where the major powers can't get along. They can't agree on anything. The economic situation, the US-China situation is complicated, and then the consequence of the Ukraine war is making the economic interests of, say, the Africans, Asians, Europeans at odds with each other. So we have a very, very difficult situation. So to the extent that India could play a positive role in Bali, where I think it played a critical role in producing a consensus on the question of Ukraine, and at least producing a document that everybody could live with. But the problem is going to get worse. I believe but making the big changes in terms of how we think about the future of the political, economic multilateralism, I think is going to be very hard. What India can do within these constraints, we can take up some issues which are of benefit to the developing countries, as well as works for the majority of the international system. There, I think those will have to be non-controversial, like on the digital side or on the health side. We can push a few issues rather than this belief somehow India can't transform the world in 9 months. I think if we can go through this crisis without a breakdown of the existing institutions, that itself will be achievement. And on the plus side, on the bonus, if India can achieve one or two major objectives. Our Chinese friends come to us and tell us, this is G20, you're going to be leader, you're also going to be in charge of SCO for the coming year. So let's go back to fighting the West. The sort of Russian friends would like to see as well. think India is not falling for the temptation. Right? India wants to represent the global south. But today, our relationship with the West, at least we're in a talking situation with the Russians, we have huge problems with the Chinese, I think puts India in a unique bridging position, which is what our minister talks about. And I think that's what, that role, how can we maximize that role to limit the damage to the multilateral system, to produce some consensus, and to develop some progressive outcomes. So I would say modest ambition we should have. While for India, I think as a diplomatic process, I think it's an opportunity for us to engage the top 20 countries in an intensive way for the next 9 months. I would say this is a really major opportunity, but I think within the constraints that the larger picture that we have.
Okay, thank you.
Andres Ortega, thank you, Professor. Very interesting expose. I get the impression that you see the confrontation. I prefer not to talk about the Cold War because it's different, with China as something unavoidable. Do you also, or do you see a kind of world order or regional order? The Chinese presence in Africa is important in Latin America for us. But do you see a kind of participation of China in a world order where they would have legitimate, I think, issues to raise, and that has to accommodate somewhat to rising powers, no? With India also. Instead of a confrontation which can be peaceful or not peaceful, but are we forced to go into confrontation, or can we find a way of living together in a different way?
First, I would say just 3 quick points. One, this is not the Cold War in a traditional sense, where you had the Soviet Russia opted out of the world economic system. They had tried to create their own economic system. But today, China is the second largest economy, deeply integrated with the Western economies, Asian economies, Latin American economies. So the conflict between US and China is fundamentally different from the nature of the conflict between US and Soviet Union during the Cold War, because there were 2 economic systems, but today there's only 1 economic system in which China is emerged as being at the top. Should we accommodate China? I would say yes. Question is again, what terms? Or would we want to accommodate them on terms that would say, look, China has the right to dominate Asia? I mean, that would be acceptable to Japan or India or the other Asian countries. Should we stop talking to China, for example, on climate change, on global economic order? We would say, look, without Chinese, we cannot have solutions. Which is where the current US strategy is saying we want to prevent the competition from becoming conflict. We want to find areas of common engagement with China on climate change, for example, or on the global economic order. But the Chinese are saying, look, I'm not ready for a la carte dining. It might be convenient for us, okay, we have to deal with climate change, but we will compete with China, but we also work with them. Chinese are saying, no, this can't be separated. That I have a vision of the world order in which my interests must be respected. And the way Xi Jinping is defining those interests is the problem. The problem for Deng Xiaoping said, look, don't fight with your neighbors, peaceful periphery, leave the disputes to your future generations, let's not quarrel over the things, like whether it's India, whether it's Japan. Deng Xiaoping took one particular view of the Chinese place to the world, and that let's integrate with the Western world. But what Xi Jinping is saying is fundamentally different. That he has an alternative framework, the Belt and Road Initiative. He's alternative institutions. He's talking about, what is it? Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative. So they and the Russians today are working together
Unfortunately, we don't have time to continue. No, but I know there are two persons that would like to ask you, but I think both of them are going to take part in the following activity. So, excuse me, Jose Maria and Mohan, but I think we can continue in the following activity. Thank you, Professor Mohan, for this fantastic keynote speech about the Indo-Pacific. We have learned quite a lot about your vision about this area and the links with Europe. And thank you again for accepting the invitation for being with us in these days in Spain. Thank you.
¿Quedáis para una foto? Y os ponéis aquí todos.